Special meeting for the City Council, Thursday, November 19th, 2020, and it's Rethink Water Joliet. Call the roll, please, or are we going to go right to the meeting?
We'll call the roll.
Okay.
Mayor Odeker?
Here.
Councilman Quinlan?
Here.
Councilman Dickinson is absent. Councilwoman Gavin?
Here.
Councilman Hug?
Here.
Councilman Morris?
Here.
Councilman Mudrin?
Here.
Councilwoman Reardon? Here. Councilman Turk?
Here.
Citizens to be heard on agenda items. There were no citizens that signed up.
All right, thank you everyone for being here tonight. This is a very big night, not only for myself and the project team, but the city as a whole, as we present the evaluation that was conducted in 2020 for the Alternative Water Source Program. At this time, I'd like to start the presentation. And our first agenda item is a update on the Water Source Program and the goals for tonight's workshop. All right, thank you. All right, so again, welcome everyone. My name is Allison Swisher. I'm the Director of Public Utilities for the City of Joliet. Also in attendance tonight, we have Teresa O'Grady and Joe Johnson. They're the project managers for the consulting team that's led this effort. Also have Barbara Adams with Donahue and Rose, who is a special legal counsel, also in attendance tonight on the other side of the wall. So not here tonight, but also very important that I want to recognize is the rest of the project team. There are many, many, many people involved in bringing this all together. And those include the firms of Engineering Enterprises, Strand Associates, V3, Images Inc., Spear Financial, Burns and McDonald, and the other City of Joliet staff in pretty much every department in the city. So it took a team of experts, thousands of hours and hundreds of pages of engineering work and financial work to put this all together. So there's no doubt that this was a comprehensive, technical, unbiased analysis of these alternatives that was done in a completely open and transparent manner through the multiple workshops that we've had with the City Council, as well as the stakeholder meetings and other public engagement that occurred during 2020. So this is the agenda for tonight's meeting. It's broken down into 4 different segments. First, again, I'll just give a quick update on the program, the work that was done in 2020, and identify the workshop goals. Then I'm going to turn it over to Joe and Teresa, and they will talk about each specific alternative. That is a presentation on the Lake Michigan Chicago Department of Water Management alternative, as well as a presentation on the Lake Michigan New Indiana intake alternative. Then we will conclude by just talking about the next steps. We will be pausing after each one of those presentations to answer questions. So, please don't feel free to ask any questions that you might have, and we'll, stop at those moments to do that. So it's a lot of information to get through. We do have 2 hours planned for this, and we, know it's hard to sit for that long. So we're planning to try and break it up and, try and, make sure everyone understands the information presented. So it is important to note what is not on the agenda, and that is the selection of the alternative water source. Tonight, is really to present the information, and then we're anticipating that selection would be in January. Okay, so really the major goal for tonight is we want to provide the business case for the 2 alternatives that were evaluated in 2020. And that business case was provided in the prospectus documents that was distributed to the council earlier this week. And those really in detail lay out the evaluation that was done and all the information that's related to those. And so after this meeting, the council and the public should understand the cost associated with those alternatives, the necessary improvements, and also the associated risks. And so once we have that understanding, then we can move forward with comparing the alternatives and then ultimately making that selection in January. Okay, so implementing a new water source is not something that happens overnight. We are on a 10-year timeline to do that, and we anticipate that we'll take every minute of those 10 years to do this project. And that includes the planning, the design, and then the construction of the infrastructure so that by 2030, the water will be flowing from the taps at everyone's home in Joliet. So guiding us over the next 10 years will be the strategic plan. This was prepared earlier this year and approved by the City Council. And this will really be our guide throughout this entire program. And at a very high level, we have a vision, and that vision is that Joliet is a leader in providing quality water in an efficient manner to our residents and potentially the region. And our mission specifically related to this program is that we'll have that new water source online by 2030. So tonight we're going to be discussing two alternatives. Both are Lake Michigan alternatives, but they are very different. So one alternative is purchasing water from the Chicago Department of Water Management, and the other alternative is building a brand new intake in Northwest Indiana. So both of these were evaluated not only as an alternative water source for Joliet, but also the region as a whole. So I've said this a number of times already, and this is not going to be an easy decision. The project team has done an excellent job of putting together two very good, very viable alternatives. And so making a decision, how are we going to do this? And it starts with the prospectus documents, which I've mentioned were prepared. And we have one for each alternative. And when you put those two side by side, it gives you that comparison to really look at what differentiates the two alternatives. So within the prospectus, there's 10 sections. They are unique sections to each alternative, are the ones shown in light green. However, there's sections that are common to both alternatives, and those are the ones that are shown in blue. So when you read those, each one stands alone, and there's different sections that will help you, evaluate the two alternatives. So the documents generally provide a very high-level overview of the alternatives and the business case for each one. And really what we did is we boiled down 3 years of work and thousands of hours of work into these two 60-page documents. So we really tried and made an effort to make this understandable and readable so that it will assist the council in making this decision. So on the next few slides, I'm going to just discuss the common elements that are common to both alternatives. Right, so this slide is not new to anyone who's been following the work associated with this program. The problem and why we've been doing all of this work is that the city's existing water source, the deep aquifer, is being depleted and is unsustainable. And based on groundwater modeling that was completed by the Illinois State Water Survey in 2018 and updated in 2020, we will not be able to provide our maximum day demands by 2030. So this is not an issue that's only related to Joliet. It's a problem that impacts all of the industries and other communities that are in the region that utilize the deep aquifer. And Joliet switching off the aquifer is not going to solve the problem for the industries or for the other communities. As this slide shows, even after Joliet switches, the area is still at significant risk for depletion. And it should be noted that no amount of water conservation will change the need to switch water sources. And the aquifer does not recharge naturally. So when it rains, that water, due to the geology, does not make its way down into the aquifer. So really, we have no option. The aquifer is not sustainable, and we have to find a new source. Other communities that are in the region that utilize the deep aquifer. So fortunately, there are multiple sources of water in northeastern Illinois. And as you can see from this slide, communities in northeastern Illinois utilize all of them. There's groundwater wells, both shallow and deep. There's river waters, Fox River, Kankakee River are utilized, and then Lake Michigan water. So in 2018, when we recognized that we had to make a switch, Mayor Odekirk initiated the alternative water source study, which was led by the city's environmental commission. This was a two-phase study. The first phase, which began in 2018, evaluated all potential alternative water sources. We wanted to make sure that we started with a completely clean slate and evaluated all potential alternatives. Those water source alternatives were evaluated based on water quality and water quantity. And based on that analysis, there were 5 alternatives that met that criteria and were forwarded to phase 2 for further evaluation. The phase 2 study was conducted in 2019 and evaluated those 5 water source alternatives for a number of other criteria. Those sources were the Illinois River, the Kankakee River, and 3 variations on Lake Michigan water. So after the completion of the phase 2 study was presented to the City Council, Lake Michigan water was selected as the city's alternative water source, and staff was directed to evaluate 2 of the Lake Michigan alternatives further. Those were the Chicago Department of Water Management and the New Indiana Intake alternatives. So the phase 1 and phase 2 studies were very comprehensive, and the reports that were prepared associated with those studies are available on the project website at rethinkwaterjoliet.org. So this is one slide that sums up a lot of work, and I'm just going to hit the highlights of each of these. But if you read through the prospectus document, there is a lot more information in section 5 that goes through exactly what each of these is. So we broke it up into 3 categories, and the first is oversight. And we had to develop a funding strategy. Regardless of which alternative is selected, it's going to require significant investment. And so we had to develop a strategy as to how to fund those improvements. It's also very important to understand what impact that will have on water rates and the average water bill that a customer in Joliet pays. So we brought on the city's rate consultant and made sure we updated that information so that we could present it to the council. Next, we did a risk analysis. We wanted to make sure that we looked at both alternatives and identified all potential risks and mitigation efforts that can be done to try and mitigate those risks. We retained an advocacy firm to conduct governmental outreach. Important to understand how state reps and federal legislators feel about the program. It's important to understand how involved we can have them be in identifying potential funding sources and overall general support for the program. And then we also did significant public outreach and stakeholder engagement. In spite of COVID restrictions, we held 3 stakeholder meetings that were attended by over 60 people at each of those meetings, and continued with over monthly e-blasts and social media posts, and also did advertising on the city's billboards. We move into the external coordination. We looked at water demand scenarios. And there's 2 demand scenarios that we presented tonight. That's a 30 MGD and a 60 MGD scenario. The 30 MGD scenario is Joliet only, while the 60 MGD scenario is a scenario that involves regional partners. We understood from the council that it was very important to evaluate these alternatives, not only as a solution for Joliet, but also for the region. This year we submitted a Lake Michigan allocation application. This was submitted in September, and we anticipate that the first pre-hearing on this issue will be held in December. With that information, it will help guide us in making this decision to understand any complications potentially that might exist with receiving that allocation, not that any are expected. We developed a plan to reduce non-revenue water to less than 10% by 2040. This is a critical component of receiving the Lake Michigan allocation, that we have a plan to reduce that non-revenue water.
Allison, real quickly, have we received any feedback from consultants about the likelihood of the allocation? Do we expect to have any problems with this?
No, we do not expect to have any problems. We have met with both the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, who administers the allocation program, as well as the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, who would govern the process and who would consult on the process in Indiana, and both have concluded that regardless of the alternative, that the Illinois Department of Natural Resources would be the agency that would be issuing the allocation, and that would be issued under Illinois' existing diversion from Lake Michigan. So when we hear things about like the Great Lakes Compact, that doesn't apply to Joliet since we are, again, using the existing diversion from Lake Michigan for Illinois. So we have, and I can provide more information at the end of the meeting on the technical legalese of that. But the bottom line is we don't expect that there would be any issues.
Thank you.
We also have spent a lot of time negotiating preliminary water purchase and access agreements. And these are binding agreements that we have negotiated with both Chicago and Hammond that really set forth and memorialize major key terms and conditions that we would anticipate that would be in the final agreements. And what we've done is we have established that those will be approved by their respective city councils prior to the Joliet City Council making a selection. We also spent a lot of time with regional development. We had meetings with over 17 communities that might be potential regional partners, and we received a lot of feedback from them. At this time, they are not able to commit to being part of the Water Commission that we discussed in August. However, the plan is that we would present them with information early next year that would help them move forward with making that decision. But I will say there is a lot of interest in partnering with Joliet on that. There's a lot of engineering work that was done, and I hate to gloss over this because it was a lot of work, but the siting of facilities, the routing of transmission mains, we really took everything to another level this year. During the phase 2 study, it was very conceptual, but we have taken that again to the next step of really trying to understand and minimize the uncertainty that was related to that work. We've developed permitting plans, met with regulators, met with potential communities that would be impacted to understand what permitting requirements they might have. We developed construction sequencing and contracting plans. We had to make sure that both alternatives could be constructed by 2030. We looked at operations and staffing. Very important to understand how these alternatives might impact how we operate and how we are staffed here in Joliet. And then lastly, we improved the cost estimating because we really wanted to make sure that the information presented, when we make this decision was more accurate. And so that's what a class 4 opinion, a probable construction cost represents. So as we started moving forward in the 2020 project, we recognized that something was missing, and that missing element was affordability. And we know this is very important to the council and to the residents of Joliet that we address the issue of whether people can afford to pay their water bills. And we know that this program's cost is going to impact all residents, but it will definitely impact some more than others. And so we need to look at how we can develop programs and look at what other communities have done to make sure that there is affordability that's considered when we start to implement these increases in water rates. So definitely more to come, but I wanted to mention that because I understand that's very important. Okay, so at this time, just pause and see if there's any questions initially about that, about what I've presented.
Questions? Yes.
So I was surprised in reading part of this that Chicago was no longer interested in doing the construction. Is that what I'm reading in this one?
It's not that Chicago is not interested in doing the construction, and Teresa will talk about this more when we talk about that alternative specifically, but we wanted to control the majority of the construction because that way we would have that control over the schedule to make sure everything was implemented by 2030. So that was important to us to have that control.
Okay.
Betty or Mike, any questions? Okay. All right.
Wait, Betty's.
Betty, you're on mute.
I don't know if she's talking to us.
Betty, you're muted.
Are you talking to me?
Can you hear us? All right, can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Once I figure out how to finagle my way through all these little buttons, I'll be okay. But Allison, one quick question.
Yes.
You said that, I thought I heard you say there were 17 possible regional partners,
Yes.
but we don't have any commitments from anybody as of yet.
That's correct. We met with 17 other communities. 13 expressed interest in continuing to, learn more information about it. We didn't really expect that anyone would commit at this point because we haven't really been able to provide details related to, the costs, how much they would have to pay. So really, that's the project team's task now, is to really start diving into that and providing them that information.
Okay, thank you so much, Allison.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
At this point, I'll turn it over to Teresa O'Grady, who's going to start the presentation on the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Teresa O'Grady, one of the project managers for the consultant team. And the first alternative that I'm going to be talking about is the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative. And I'm going to start out by talking about a description of the alternative, as well as some of the key terms for the water supply agreement. And as Allison said, this was developed for both the Joliet only, the 30 MGD scenario, as well as the Joliet plus the region, or we call it the Water Commission scenario, that's 60 MGD. So when I'm talking about stuff that Joliet has to do, just know that that could be interchanged for Water Commission as well, whether it's a 30 or 60 or somewhere in between. So first of all, this alternative involves purchasing treated finished water from the city of Chicago and pumping it to Joliet. Now, it sounds simple, but it's made a little bit more difficult by the fact that it's so far away, and the infrastructure that needs to be constructed on Chicago side at the Chicago Southwest Pumping Station site is challenging. So we're going to start first describing the alternative. And so on the screen there, on the right-hand side of the screen, we have Lake Michigan. And so the facilities or the boxes in the black solid line are existing Chicago facilities, starting with the water source, which is the 68th Street and Dunn intake crib. And then there's a 14-mile intake tunnel that goes to the Eugene Sawyer Water Purification Plant, where the water is treated to drinking water standards. From there, it travels through the South Tunnel system to the Southwest Pumping Station. And so it would be really easy if the Southwest Pumping Station had enough capacity to serve Joliet and the region, but it doesn't. So part of what we need to do is construct facilities at the Southwest Pumping Station site to allow for, number one, a safe connection to the facilities, and number two, a break in ownership where Joliet can then get the treated water from Chicago. So continuing then on the process there, the dashed lines are the new infrastructure. So we start with the new tunnel connection that has to be made to intercept the South Tunnel system at the Southwest Pumping Station. And then we have the new tunnel extension. We have low service pump station that basically pumps the water out of the tunnel. And then we have what we're calling the Chicago service valve. This is the break in ownership that we've determined between Chicago and Joliet, after the low service pump station, but before the meter vault. And so part of this involves what we're calling Chicago new infrastructure and Joliet new infrastructure. And the Chicago new infrastructure is the infrastructure that Chicago would ultimately own and operate. And so that point of demarcation with the Chicago service valve becomes important. So that's the break point in ownership. And after that, there has to be a disconnect. We call it an air gap, but a disconnect between the Chicago system and the Joliet system so that there's no potential for intermingling of water there. And that's achieved through that low service pump station pumping into what we're calling the new suction well. And the new suction well is just a underground water storage tank there at the site. And so the low service pump station pumps into that with an air gap. And then from the new suction well, there would be a new high service pump station that would then pump the water all the way to Joliet. So again, past that point of demarcation, the Chicago service valve, in that dashed blue would all be new infrastructure that Joliet would own, operate, and maintain. So this is a slide showing where those facilities would be on the site. All of these new facilities would be located at the Southwest Pumping Station site, with the low service pump station and the high service pump station located on the south end of the site. And then the new suction well would actually be located in the adjacent Durkin Park, west of the Southwest Pumping Station site. So we'll talk about the agreement terms in just a minute, but one of the conditions is that Chicago would acquire the land rights from the Chicago Park District for Joliet to use the Durkin Park for the new suction well. And that would end up being located under one of the baseball diamonds. So we've talked about now the Chicago new water supply infrastructure and the Joliet new water supply infrastructure, and those are all located at the Southwest Pumping Station site. Anything off of that site is all Joliet owned, operated, maintained. And so we'll talk about those in the next slide. So in the upper right-hand corner there is the Chicago Southwest Pumping Station, and there would be a finished water transmission main that would go approximately 31 miles then to Joliet. And all that, again, would be owned, operated, maintained by the city of Joliet. This transmission main would range in diameter from 48-inch to 68-inch or 60-inch, depending on the capacity, whether it's 30 MGD or 60 MGD. And that's that blue line shown on the exhibit there. Somewhere in the middle, there would have to be an intermediate pump station. Given the length of transmission main and ground elevation, we'd have an intermediate pumping station step in there. And then as you get to Joliet, it's a yellow dot there. There would be a receiving station, and that would serve as an entry point to the Joliet system, as well as the starting point for the Joliet distribution improvements. And we've talked about this before, that right now the Joliet system has multiple entry points with the wells. And now with the new source, regardless of which alternative is, it's only a single entry point. So there's got to be a way to get the water across the system. And that's the Joliet distribution improvements or modifications. And that's the red line shown there. And that's for the 30 MGD alternative. We also looked at what it would be for the 60 MGD alternative, and that's that green dashed line. And that has assumptions on what communities would join and how that would all work. That has yet to be determined, depending on what communities would join Joliet to form the Water Commission. So two other things to note on this slide that are not on here but are part of the improvements is there would have to be additional storage that would be constructed in the Joliet system because of requirements to have 2 times average day demand in storage. So there would be storage and pumping that would have to be constructed. And then the other thing to note is that the city's wells would be maintained as a backup supply. In the event, in this case, of a break in the transmission main or a loss of water service from the city of Chicago that would last longer than the storage can provide. So as this alternative involves purchasing treated finished water from the city of Chicago, the city of Joliet would enter into a water supply agreement with the city of Chicago. And so as part of the 2020 evaluation, a preliminary water supply agreement was negotiated, and that was included in the Appendix A of the prospectus document. So you can see those exact terms and conditions there. So Chicago will be presenting it to their city council on November 24th, for approval then on December 16th. So, a couple things to note with this. The terms of the condition of the agreement with Chicago and Joliet that have been negotiated are significantly different than Chicago has with their current water customers. And that's important, and we'll go through that with these key terms and conditions. It was also different than what was presented in the Phase 2 study. We've made a lot of headway in the last year, and it's been on both sides, and we've come to a good spot with the preliminary water supply agreement. So on the screen here, we have key terms that are incorporated into the preliminary water supply agreement. And I'm going to talk about a few of these, but there's a few that are shown in the asterisk that I actually have a separate slide for. So the agreement term that is proposed is a 50-year term with 10-year renewals. And those are renewals that will continue until one party terminates. It's been termed as an evergreen type of contract. So with real estate matters, the agreement is conditional on Chicago obtaining land at Durkin Park for the new suction well, as well as the use of the Southwest Pumping Station for Joliet facilities. In addition, there have been provisions that have been included in the preliminary water supply agreement for transfer to a water commission if it's formed. It also has provisions that Chicago cannot transfer the agreement to a third party without Joliet's approval. And it has provisions in there that Joliet cannot sell the water system without Joliet's approval. I know that was a concern that was brought up previously, but that is written into the agreement.
Just for clarification, Chicago cannot sell the water system.
Correct. Did I say it wrong? Yeah. I'm sorry. Chicago cannot sell the water system without Joliet approval.
A question. Currently, all the customers they have don't have that, right?
Not that I'm aware of. We can talk to Barb here, but that's not included in current agreements, that specific language.
Would that be during the duration of 50 years only or in perpetuity?
It would be the 50-year agreement. How it's written is that after the 50-year term is up, that there are reopeners that could occur. So we can get the Barb in towards the end of this, and she'll be able to answer any additional legal questions. So I'll keep going. So rights and responsibilities of the party, and we talked a little bit about that with the question regarding who would build what. So the agreement addresses these rights and responsibilities. So Chicago has a responsibility to provide water quality, meeting drinking water standards, and they've agreed to provide the quantity of the full range being contemplated for Joliet and Joliet plus the regional customers. So responsibility for construction of the new water supply infrastructure at the Southwest Pumping Station site was negotiated to allow for Joliet to have the most control of the design and construction of those components, and ultimately control of the schedule. So Joliet will design and construct all of the infrastructure except for the tunnel connection, in which Chicago will design and construct that. Chicago will finance or pay for all of the Chicago water supply infrastructure that Joliet designs and constructs. So that's the tunnel extension, the low service pump station, and the Chicago service valve. And then for the Joliet new water supply infrastructure, which includes the meter vault, the suction well, the high service pump station, and then the transmission main, that would all be designed, constructed, owned, and operated by Joliet. And so the last thing on there we kind of talked about earlier was the water storage requirements. Joliet has agreed to maintain 2 times the average day demand in storage past the transmission main. This will allow Chicago to perform routine maintenance, which might impact the water service to Joliet. So the preliminary water supply agreement also includes the basis for costs and fees. So until now, in fact, for many decades, there was one rate that was paid, and everyone paid the same uniform rate, whether that was retail customers in Chicago or wholesale water customers. Through the 2020 evaluation, we have negotiated a wholesale rate that is based on cost of service to Joliet. What does that mean? It means that Joliet would only be paying for the facilities used by Joliet for water service. And this is important because that's, as we showed on the screen previously, that's the 68th Street Dunn Crib. That's the 14-foot tunnel that goes to Eugene Sawyer Water Purification Plant. That's the South Tunnel System. And those would be the facilities Joliet would be paying for. Joliet would not be paying for lead service line replacement in Chicago, would not be paying for metering in Chicago, and would not be paying for water main replacement in Chicago. So this is a significant difference than current wholesale customers of Chicago. And so like I said, it's very different than what was assumed in phase 2. And I know you're interested in what that means to Joliet. I'll let Joe talk about the costs here in a minute. So before we do that, one reason that we, meaning Joliet, has been able to negotiate these agreement terms is Chicago's new commitment to transparency and collaboration that has now been memorialized in the preliminary water supply agreement. And this commitment includes Chicago forming an advisory council comprised of representatives of Chicago, Joliet, and other wholesale purchasers. While this is only an advisory group, it allows for meaningful input, regular communications, and the ability for members to make recommendations for reliable and cost-effective delivery of water for Chicago's consideration. Again, this is not something that currently exists. It's something that Chicago would be forming. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Joe to continue on the discussion of Chicago Department of Water Management alternative, talking about implementation considerations and cost.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you for having us here tonight. My name is Joe Johnson. I'm a project manager with Stantec and another member of the project team. So Teresa has walked you through some of the things that the team's been able to do this year, working with the city to reduce uncertainty about the infrastructure required to bring water to Joliet from Chicago, as well as the terms and agreements that would be required with the city of Chicago. What I'm going to do is move that forward, I think. More time. There we go. Sorry about that. Talk a little bit about what it takes to actually implement that alternative and then how much it's going to cost. These are critical factors in the decision-making process. As Allison outlined earlier, it takes a lot of work to bring one of these systems to fruition. In addition to the design and construction work that we've talked about, there's land acquisition, permitting, operations and staffing changes, and a whole implementation plan that have to be put into place to make sure that all the pieces work together and that we get to our end goal in the time that we've set. That's part of the evaluation the team has done this year, is to understand what those critical concerns are. And we'll talk about some of those as we look at an overall schedule. This is the bar chart that shows an illustration of the number of independent contracts, construction contracts that could be required to implement the Chicago alternative for Joliet. As you can see, there's, I think, about 17 different contracts listed there, ranging from work at the Southwest Pump Station site, as Teresa discussed, to transmission main work, to work in the Joliet system. That work has to occur over this 10-year period in order to meet our goal of delivering water by 2030. And each project has phases that range from preliminary design, final design, contracting, permitting, land acquisition. We've looked at these, and a couple of conclusions are important. Number one, the project is feasible. It's doable to build all this infrastructure within the time frame, to implement the project and to bring water to Joliet. At the same time, as you can see from the chart, it requires a significant amount of coordination, significant amount of preparation, and advanced work for the items like land acquisition and permitting. The land acquisition is shown here in kind of the heavier green bars for some of the contracts. In some places, a number of activities will overlap. But the key takeaway is that the project can be built, but it's going to require a robust program of coordination to make sure that all the critical decisions are implemented and the actions are accomplished so that the pieces line up and we're able to implement parts of the project as we go forward. One of the key takeaways early on was that the work Teresa talked about in Chicago will likely need to start early in the process. So some of that work is shown going into construction as early as 2024. So that work can be completed. It's a tight site. The work has to be done sequentially, but we need to have that work done so that we can then start to bring water out towards Joliet as the transmission main pieces come online. So moving on beyond the implementation, what this really boils down to is how much is it going to cost? What does it take? How much money is going to be required? And so we've looked at this from a couple of angles. Number one, if you recall from last year, we talked about the total cost of water for the project. So we've looked at everything from the water purchase costs to the capital and financing costs, as well as the operation, maintenance, and replacement costs associated with the project. Those all add up to the total expenditure that has to be made to make the project a reality. Then beyond that, we've said, okay, so what does that mean for Joliet? What is our funding strategy? How are we going to finance that work? What would the impact be on rates? And what is this 50-year total cost of water if we roll up the cost of all the elements of the project to understand it? So the first point, and Teresa talked a little bit about this, but this is really a big deal, and I think it's important for us to take a moment and understand this. In the Chicago alternative, a significant part of the overall cost of the project over the life of its operation, or over a long period of time, is the money that will be paid to Chicago to purchase treated water, right? Chicago is taking on the responsibility for pulling water out of the lake and treating it. That's not something that Joliet has to worry about in this alternative. And then Joliet pays to receive that treated water. Historically, as Teresa mentioned, Chicago's had a uniform rate that they charge all of their customers, so many dollars per 1,000 gallons. Through a lot of the hard work that Allison and Teresa and others have put in working with the city, and a lot of cooperation from the city, they've developed now a process where they've agreed that they would base their rate on the cost of service. So annually, there would be an analysis done to determine what is the actual cost for operating, maintaining, running the facilities, the specific facilities that deliver water to Joliet. And the way the process is structured, there would be still this uniform water rate, but then each year there would be an adjustment based on the audit of the previous year. So if you want to think about it, it's a little bit like your escrow. If you have a mortgage with an escrow, right? There's an estimate that gets added into your monthly bill to pay that amount. At the end of the year, they look at it, true it up, and make an adjustment going into the next year. The net effect of this is that while the uniform rate for water in Joliet, say in 2018, was $3.95 a 1,000 gallons, the net rate that Joliet would pay after the adjustments based on the cost of service for Joliet is $3.21. So, 74 cents a 1,000 gallons less than the uniform rate. The analysis last year was based on that uniform rate, as that's the way Chicago's approached this in the past. So that is an important factor, and it plays into the cost as we look at them going forward.
Question.
Yes.
So if I understand it correctly, then the uniform rate is what they give to all their customers, which has consideration not just for the cost of service for that customer, but system-wide, kind of spreading the cost of maintenance and upgrades for the system.
Correct. And then
Which
that's,
would include water main replacements in the city of Chicago.
they've spread that cost out equally over their Chicago customers and their bulk customers in the past. Everybody, whether you're in the city or whether you're outside the city, has paid the same rate, and that revenue that they generated supported all the operations of the city as well as all the work that they were doing.
But this new wholesale program, if you want to refer to it that way, would exclude it. It would just be the actual cost to get it to Joliet and Joliet's other customers, which would be on us.
That's correct. That's correct. It's a cost of service based approach, which is an industry standard approach that's been well documented. So, but it is a significant change from last year. So that's the water purchase cost, and we'll see how that rolls up. The second component of the cost are the capital costs. And again, there is significant infrastructure that Joliet has to build to make this project a reality, from the high service pump station, the transmission main, the intermediate pump station. And I want to be clear, the local distribution improvements in Joliet are not insignificant. The effort and the amount of work that's required to distribute water coming in at one point now across the whole of Joliet, there's significant cost. So if you look at these graphs, there are 4 circles up here if you want to look at it that way. The top 2 are for the 30 MGD Joliet only scenario. The bottom 2 are for 60 MGD. The left-hand chart in each pair is current 2020 dollars. So when we estimate the cost of construction of these elements, we do it in current dollars. That's what we can get quotes on. But it's very important in a long-term program like this to realize that those costs will escalate. Some of these construction contracts won't be let until 2025, 2026. So we need to consider that cost of escalation. So the charts on the right-hand side show that the cost of the construction escalated to the midpoint of construction. So it takes that into account. And without going through all the details here, the bottom line is the 30 MGD option. We're looking at a little under $600 million of capital construction in 2020 dollars to build those facilities. To go to the 60 MGD option, it's about $810 million. So it's an increase, but, and this is an important point, there are economies of scale. So as you can imagine, the cost to double the capacity of the system doesn't necessarily double the cost of the system. And so if we can increase the capacity, increase the amount of water we can provide without doubling the cost, there is a net benefit at the end of the day. So there are some benefits to a regional approach, and that's, the council recognized this when we talked in August, and there was support for looking for a commission-type approach. The other note, other item of note is when you look at the relative costs here in terms of the capital costs, about 2/3 of the costs are the water transmission and delivery infrastructure. So that's the pipeline to bring the water from Chicago to the Joliet area. The other third is in the 30 MGD option are the local Joliet improvements to get the water throughout all of Joliet. Or in the regional option, that other third is a combination of local Joliet improvements and this regional network of pipes. Again, so there's a benefit from the commission option because now you have all your partners collaborating and sharing in the cost of that regional network. So we've talked about the purchased water cost, the capital cost. The other element is operating maintenance and replacement costs. And these are important because they go on over the life of the project, right? So these are costs that are incurred every year. But for this option, there's an important item to note. There are significant additional operating maintenance and replacement costs associated with the infrastructure for Chicago. So for the 30 MGD option, we're showing about $4.7 million a year. 60 MG, about 6.9 million. And then out of that 60 MGD system, if you look at it and break it up in terms of what Joliet's share would be versus what the other potential partner share might be, Joliet's share would be about 4.3 million. So again, there's that economy of scale showing up. The other important thing here, though, is while it seems like it's going to cost a lot of money to pump water all the way from Chicago, Joliet is already pumping water from several hundred feet below ground right now. So your deep wells they're called deep wells because water level is low and it's continuing to drop. We've looked at what will be the cost savings that Joliet will recognize and reduced energy and other costs when you move away from using your deep wells and your current water treatment plants. And that works out to almost $4 million a year. So there's a significant cost savings from moving from your current groundwater system to this system. And in the Chicago option, it doesn't quite balance out, but the net increase in operating maintenance and replacement costs is relatively modest. It's in that range of $700,000 for the 30 MGD option or $300,000 for the 60 MGD. So there is that trade-off. While we're now buying treated water and we do have to bring it all the way from Chicago, some of those costs are offset by not having to operate the existing wells and treatment plants here. So now we know what the costs are, the purchased water, the capital costs, the O&M costs. How are we going to pay for this? What are we going to do? So the The last two columns on this chart, the bottom right-hand, these are the escalated costs, the escalated capital costs at the midpoint of construction for the 30 and the 60 MGD options. So the funding plan that's been put in place takes advantage of some low-interest opportunities that Joliet has been very aggressive in pursuing. You've heard us talk about WIFIA. WIFIA is the Water Infrastructure Financing and Innovation Act. It's a federal program administered by US EPA that provides low-interest money, low-interest loans with pretty favorable terms for very large projects. It's focused really on large projects of this type. Last year, Joliet submitted a letter of interest and was selected by US EPA and put on the list for a WIFIA loan. That means at the end of 2021, we have to submit an application to EPA that would then move us forward with trying to secure a loan for up to 49% of our project costs. A supplement to that WIFIA application was put in this year as well, and there's ongoing discussions with EPA, so they're aware of the progress of the project. Our goal would be to have that program fund approximately 49% of the overall cost. We would have another chunk of the project funded through state revolving fund loans. This is an existing program that happens or is administered by Illinois EPA. Joliet uses it extensively already, but again, provides low interest loans with favorable terms. And then the balance, and there would be some balance that couldn't be covered by the low interest loans in the early years, as well as in years where there's a significant amount of expenditure, would have to be covered by revenue bonds. So we've looked at this funding strategy and then baked the financing costs associated with this into the overall cost of water. So then what's the impact on rates? Let's cut to the chase. This is what's really important, right, for the residents. How does this affect water rates in Joliet? The two charts here, the chart in the upper right shows annual rate increase levels associated with the 30 MGD or the 60 MGD alternatives. So 30 is the lighter colored bar, 60 MGD is the darker colored bar. And then the chart in the lower right shows the progression of typical monthly bills, cost of monthly bills in Joliet, based on the financing that's required for this project. And as Allison said, we realize that this is not trivial. These are significant increases in the bills, but it's important to lay this out so that people understand what that looks like. It's also important to understand that some of the early rate increases are driven by other capital projects, such as the non-revenue water project that Allison talked about, the need to replace more water main to reduce the level of non-revenue water in Joliet. That's common across whatever alternative we approach. So the takeaway here in 2030, the average water bill, and I want to be clear, this is water only. I know the residents receive a bill that includes water, sewer, and refuse collection. So this is the water component of that. Would be about $90 a month in 2030. By 2040 would grow to about $143 per month. So these are not insignificant numbers, and again, that's why Allison talked about affordability and making sure we understand how that plays in.
Joe, I had a question, and Allison, we talked about this the other day. If possible, and if not tonight, going forward, could you provide some type of analysis or chart about what other cities or other water systems will be paying in 2030, 2040, so we have some basis of comparison?
Absolutely. There is one chart in the prospectus that just has some current rates, but yes, Allison talked to us about that. We've been collecting some other data and we can do those projections. A question someone had also asked is, what would Joliet's rate likely be if we still had groundwater and we didn't do this project? What would that increase? Because there would be increases between now and 2040 as well. So we can provide some of that information so that that's clear.
And just in general, is this way out of whack with what other cities will be paying, or is this the trend?
It's not. I mean, if you look at there's a chart in the prospectus that shows some current rates, and there are currently some Lake Michigan communities, where they are paying significant amounts of money on a monthly basis, upwards of $10 a thousand gallons, and I would have to run these backwards to convert them. But it's not out of the realm of reality. I think we do have to realize Joliet is a long way from Chicago, from Lake Michigan, so it is going to cost more to get the water out here. But I think if you look at other communities that are also a distance, and the communities that have Lake Michigan water, it's not out of the realm of other communities' reality.
Thank you.
So
Yes, Councilman.
we do have, or you do have, an analysis or projection of what the current rates and current system would be over the same period, or you will come up with that for us?
Well, we can present that. I think we'll obviously have to make some assumptions about what would happen, what the additional capital improvements would, but we certainly know from this alternative, we can take this approach and basically strip out all the costs associated with this improvement project and see what would it be otherwise and show that to you.
I just want to point out that this does include other improvements necessary to the water system. So these increases are not related specifically to the water, alternative water source program. So we did incorporate, other increases, as Joe mentioned, for the water main replacement program that we have and our other capital program. I mean, we spend already, within the water system about $10 million, annually, and that's going to be increasing. So we did incorporate those, other items associated with the water system into these rates.
And then the other question I had, currently, I don't think it's exact, but the amount of water in and the amount of water out is part of how we calculate sewer, right? Will we have, and I don't know, this is more probably for you, Allison, and the consultants, will we have a different formula once we have this new water source because a certain large portion of the increase on the water billing side is for the capital improvements, which doesn't affect the sewer?
Well, I mean, the way the sewer bill is calculated is based on water usage, because the assumption is if you use the water, it goes into the sewer and is then treated. So I don't see that we would change that overall philosophy as far as how we bill sewer, but we are also working on trying to build out the financial or the rate forecasting to incorporate the sewer component as well, so we could get that holistic picture of what the overall bill would be.
Thank you.
So the last item on cost, and then I'll turn it back over to Allison to summarize this alternative. Last year, we introduced this concept of a 50-year total cost of water. I think as you've seen tonight, there are upfront costs, there are capital costs that will be incurred in the next 10 years. There are purchased water and operating costs that will go on over the life of the project. So it is important to roll that all up so we can start to see what that looks like over a 50-year period. So these are what I'd say are all-in costs. This is looking over the next 50 years, what are the costs to construct, operate, maintain, purchase water, to run this alternative for the next 50 years. The bar on the left is again the 30 MGD option, the middle is the 60 MGD, and then the last one is what we estimate Joliet's share of the 60 MGD alternative would be. And the different colors, and it's important in this particular alternative, the largest components of those costs are the capital costs and then the purchased water cost. Those are the two big components in this side because the only additional operation is really operating the pump stations and transmission mains. As we talked about, there's a credit for not having to operate your existing system. So that summarizes those numbers. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Allison. Oh, I'm sorry, one more point. Sorry, false start. One of the variables that goes into that 50-year cost of water calculation is an assumption about how the purchased water rate will escalate over time. So Chicago is committed to this cost of service model, but their cost of service is going to increase over time, as any water utilities would. And it's hard to predict what that rate increase or what that percentage increase over time will be. We had originally run our numbers based on a 2% annual increase in their cost of service. So that $3.21 rate that we talked about that Chicago would charge after adjustments, we've assumed that would increase at 2% per year over the life of the operation. In discussions with Chicago, they made the argument that the facilities that Joliet is relying on are mature facilities, but they're in very good shape. They put a lot of investment into them in recent time, and they felt that 2% was probably high, it was conservative, that maybe we should look at a lower typical rate increase over time on the purchased water cost. So this slide shows that same 50-year cost of water based on a 1.3% per year increase in that purchased water rate, whereas the first slide I showed was 2%. And it is this analysis is sensitive to that number. For example, the 30 MGD number for the 2% annual increase, it's $1.6 billion over 50 years. For the 1.3% here, it's $1.4 billion. So we're talking about $200 million over 50 years. But it is a significant sensitivity, and it's a variable. It's not something that is specifically defined. So with that, I'm going to give it back to Allison.
All right, thank you, Joe. And so I'm going to wrap up the analysis of the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative by discussing some of the risks associated with it, and also the strength, weakness, opportunity, threat analysis that we conducted. So we've seen this slide before. Reducing uncertainty was a major goal of the 2020 evaluation. And to reduce that uncertainty, we needed to look at what the risks associated with the alternatives were, and then ways that we could mitigate them. So within each prospectus document, in section 7, there is a list of risks that were identified, not only by the project team, but also by the city council and other stakeholders. And so within there, we scored the risks based on the likelihood that they would occur, and then the consequences if they did occur. And those were scored by low, moderate, and high.
And Allison, one question.
Sure.
The projection of 1.3 to 2% increase for cost of finishing or producing the water to us. Mm-hmm. So we'll say an average of 1.5 for a year increase. While our increases over the last 30 or 40 years have been by legislative action, do we have any idea what our average, say over last 40 years increase was? Is it in line? Over the last 40 years, did we increase year to year on average? Sometimes we didn't increase for 7 or 8 years, and then we went up 8%, right? Is it comparable to that, do we know?
I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look at the history of Joliet rate increases, but we do know that the industry standard is about 5.5%, if that's what you look at, for all utilities across the country. A lot of that is tied to just the fact that these have increased significantly in recent years because there has been a deferral of maintenance that was, just the norm in the industry. So now people are playing catch up on that. So, I think the consideration to make, as Joe said, is that it's different with this wholesale rate calculation, that escalation, we felt that 2% was a conservative, was a appropriate number to use, but we did want to present the lower escalation factor. And we also, in the documents, more detailed documents, have done an analysis of what if the escalation was higher than that, because we, can't predict the future over the next 50 years. So, all we can do is that is definitely a risk with the alternatives, is just what that escalation factor.
And this specifically addresses the wholesale cost, not the retail cost.
That's correct. So, we in Joliet will then have to set a rate, for our customers to pay, and that escalation factor will then be dependent upon not only the purchased water costs and how that escalates, but also how any costs that we have to pay that are related to our retail, service associated with meters and water main replacement and water service line replacement, how that has to get funded.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so as I was saying about the likelihood and consequence of risk, you don't want to have a high likelihood and high consequence. That would be a risk, that would be a major reason for concern. And so for the Chicago Department of Water Management, through the work we've done this year to mitigate a lot of risks, we did not identify any risks that would be in that red area. But we did identify, risks and classify them into 4 different, categories. And a lot of the risks that were identified have been completely mitigated, but we did still provide them as information, just so, it was understood that those were addressed. So in the first category, which is the agreement terms and conditions, as Teresa mentioned, sale of the water system was a significant concern, and we feel like we have mitigated that through the preliminary agreement. Change of administration, is there likelihood that future administrations in Chicago won't support this concept and the new framework that Chicago has proposed? And again, we feel that this is protected by the agreement. And then lastly, the payment for items not related to Joliet. And Teresa and Joe both touched on this. You know, we would specifically stated in the agreement that we would not be paying for lead service line replacement in Chicago, water main replacement in Chicago, meter replacement or installation in Chicago. So all of those items are risks that we feel have been mitigated. The next category is control, and control refers to many things, such as operation of the system, decisions related to water treatment, and then, ultimately how the rate and the escalation of that rate, is set by would be set by the Chicago City Council. However, as Teresa mentioned, we feel the advisory council, is providing good effort and ways to mitigate some of those concerns related to that. So while we, will be giving up that control over those issues through the advisory council, we'll still have a voice and an opportunity to provide input. And the next category is aged infrastructure. So Chicago has demonstrated that they have done a good job of maintaining the infrastructure that would be used to serve Joliet. However, we have to acknowledge that it is over 70 years old. The water treatment plant was built in 1947, and the tunnel system is as old. So we also have to acknowledge that there's emerging contaminants that are an issue. I know we've all heard of PFAS and other issues that could impact Lake Michigan. And the current system of treatment at Chicago's Eugene Sawyer plant does not treat for the removal of emerging contaminants. So if there were to be future regulations regarding that, that would be a significant capital expenditure to upgrade that facility to do that removal. However, in discussions with Chicago, they've been very proactive in monitoring this. They've done a lot of water quality sampling and feel that the results that they're getting of the raw water and then ultimately the treated water is that it's below any of the limits that are currently contemplated. And so then the last risk category was regarding land acquisition. As Teresa mentioned, for the facilities at the Southwest pumping site, we have really good feeling regarding the ability of Chicago to obtain an agreement with the Chicago Park District for use of the Durkin site. They've already had discussions with the Park District, and the Park District Board is very aware and supportive of that land transfer. And then other facilities, as far as land acquisition, a lot of land acquisition associated with the transmission main, intermediate pumping station, and to mitigate that risk, as we discussed in August, the ability to form a water commission and utilize the water commission and the special land rights that that commission would offer would be the way to mitigate risks associated with that.
Allison,
Yes.
you and I had discussed this earlier today, and 50 years sounds like a long time, but it does go by very quickly. Mm-hmm. And I'm still concerned that at the end of the 50-year period, water could be a really precious commodity. And what if Chicago decides not to re-up an agreement, and then Joliet's beholden to them at whatever cost they decide, because they'll probably need the money. So how do we protect ourselves against that if we were to go with this plan?
Yes, it's important to note that the 50-year term is something that is stipulated by the Water Commission statutes. So there, we also feel that we wouldn't necessarily recommend a term longer than 50 years because while Chicago, as you suggested, could be in a position where they would want to change the deal, Joliet could also be in that position where we would want to renegotiate the deal because, again, 50 years isn't a long time, mm-hmm. But we wouldn't want to be bound.
No, that's understood, but I was just wondering what safety measures or protection measures we could put in for whoever's sitting in this seat down the road and to protect the citizens, because I wouldn't want them saying, what were they thinking of 50 years ago? They had enough issues going on without screwing up the water.
Yes, so one key component that we did negotiate is this evergreen arrangement. So, we would have the terms of the agreement automatically renew for those 10-year periods. There is the opportunity for a party to give 5 years notice for non-renewal, but that though, up to the 50 years, we do have the contractual, terms, in place. And, we don't, Chicago's never terminated an agreement with anyone before. But, again, that is a risk that we can't necessarily mitigate, that, in 50 years,
Understood. That's just a concern of mine.
Yes.
We talked about that earlier.
yeah, no, understood.
Thank you.
Okay, in section 8, then we did a SWOT analysis, which identified strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And there's a lot of information in the prospectus, but I'm just going to hit the highlights of each category. So definitely the strength that we identified for Chicago is that it's an established water supplier. They provide high quality water to millions of people in northeastern Illinois. The weakness identified is that the city would give up control of water production and the setting the rates and the purchase water costs. And we've used this analogy before of being a customer means you're an equivalent, you're kind of the renter, you're not a homeowner. So there's definitely then those concerns that come along with that. You are giving up that control, but then you also gain a strength in that you don't have that liability or responsibility for water production. We really see an opportunity in working with Chicago. The concept of regionalization is one that has come up frequently. The city's existing infrastructure has the capacity to serve Joliet, and then there's really economies of scale then in working with the city. The major threat, and we've talked about this and Joe hit on it, is just really there's a number of factors that are beyond our control that introduces some additional uncertainty of what could happen into the future related to emerging contaminants. If other wholesale customers depart from Chicago's system, that would increase Joliet's costs. And, so there's just that level of uncertainty that remains. So finally, to conclude this section on the Chicago Department of Water Management, we just wanted to lay out the business case. And so over the past year, Chicago has demonstrated a real commitment to improving their relationship with their wholesale customers. The preliminary agreement that we've negotiated with them supports that. And, that is that wholesale rate concept that is just a major change in Chicago's approach. Going with the Chicago alternative really reduced the effort, time, costs, and risks that are associated with operating a water treatment facility and the intake and the work associated with that. But we do, give up control over the water production and treatment and then the future water rates. And so when we look at this, we look at, really, the long-term risks that are associated with the customer arrangement. We've talked before too about that the infrastructure is aged, doesn't treat for emerging contaminants. However, Chicago has discussed that they have a plan for this and that they have maintained their infrastructure. And then, really to boil it down, we just have the opportunity to, leverage the knowledge that Chicago has. They've been, doing this for, hundreds of years and, have the expertise to provide high quality water. All right, so that concludes the Chicago session. We'll pause again for questions. If you could switch over, Chris.
Allison, could I ask one question?
Yes.
And I don't know if this was even an appropriate question or not, or if it was been addressed, but does the size of the pumping station and the water mains with the piping that would run to Joliet, does that have much of an effect, or is it dependent on the number of partners we eventually have?
Yeah, I'll have Teresa answer that. There are different sizes depending on how many communities participate.
And the only reason I ask that is, should we have a pretty good idea when we do vote on this, how many partners we think we're going to have, or we should have, so that we, don't overdo it or underdo it?
I think that we will not have people commit until they know what the source is. So it's kind of the chicken egg scenario, because you know, we can't finalize and present to them what those, you know, costs will be. So I don't think we were expecting, or could expect that the regional partners make that commitment until after the selection is made.
Mike,
Thank you.
yeah, Mike, we're gonna have to make the selection and then we're gonna have to sell it to the people who are interested. They're obviously not gonna commit to something that doesn't exist.
Mike, did you want more information on the pipe sizing, or was that kind of the answer to your
No, that's
question?
fine. That was just a general question.
Okay.
At all.
Okay. Okay, I don't see any other questions specifically related to the Chicago alternative, so I will turn it back over to Teresa, and we will start talking about the Indiana alternative.
Okay, so the second alternative that we're going to talk about is the new Indiana intake alternative. And again, I'll start out by talking about the description of the alternative as well as those key terms for the access agreement. And as I stated last time, when I refer to Joliet and Joliet's responsibilities, if it's a 60 MGD alternative, it would be the same as referring to the Water Commission. So this alternative involves Joliet developing an entirely new Lake Michigan water supply system through the construction of a new Lake Michigan intake, access from Hammond, Indiana, and pumping raw water over 48 miles to Joliet for treatment. So again, we have an exhibit on the right-hand side here, and that yellow star is the new intake crib. This location was chosen based on a number of factors, including water depth, navigational channels, known shipwreck locations, and it was investigated for raw water quality. One of the things we wanted to make sure is, based on this location on the south end of the lake, that the raw water quality wouldn't be significantly different than what would be at other locations, and that we wanted to verify that it could be treated to drinking water standards. So that is part of the information and that we did during 2020. From the crib, there would be about a 7,000 foot intake pipe tunneled to the shores of Hammond. And then at the shores, there would be a shore facility that would consist of screening and pumping that would then send the water through a raw water transmission main to Joliet. And so again, that raw water transmission main would range in diameter from 48 inch to 60 inch, depending on the capacity, whether it's a 30 MGD system or a 60 MGD system. And one thing to note, for the transmission main that would be in Indiana, it would be entirely located in Hammond. And that's part of the access agreement I'll talk about shortly. So we've talked about the majority of the things on the slide there. I'm going to go to the next slide to then give the overview. In the upper right-hand corner, again, is that Lake Michigan intake crib location that we saw on the previous slide. And the transmission main, raw water transmission main that would go through Indiana. Once in Illinois, the raw water transmission main would continue to Joliet. Similar to before, there would be an intermediate pump station given the length that would be needed, not only because of the length, but because of ground elevation. Once it got to Joliet, then we would have the treatment plant near Joliet. And that would treat the water to drinking water standards. And in addition, as we discussed at the August City Council workshop, it would utilize advanced water treatment processes capable of treatment of known emerging contaminants. Then the pump station at the water treatment plant would serve as the entry point to the Joliet distribution system, as well as the starting point for the Joliet distribution system modifications that are shown in red on the screen, again, to distribute the water throughout the system. Also similarly, we show the green dashed lines on the exhibit that are for the regional pipe network. And again, that's for the 60 MGD alternative, and it assumes different communities would participate in that. Again, there would be storage and pumping that would be added to the Joliet distribution system to get to that 2 times the average day demand in storage, as well as the city would maintain the existing groundwater wells as a backup source in the event of a break in that transmission main. So for this alternative, the city of Joliet would enter into an access agreement with the city of Hammond, Indiana. As part of the 2020 evaluation, a preliminary water access agreement or access agreement was negotiated with the city of Hammond and was provided in the appendix to the prospectus that you guys got earlier this week. So this will be presented to the council to the Hammond City Council on November 23rd for approval. And one thing to note is this is not a water purchase agreement, it's an access agreement. And that is to allow for access to and use of right-of-ways and easements for Hammond-owned and Hammond-controlled property. So the agreement terms, I'm going to go through, I'll talk about the costs on the next slide, but the agreement term proposed is a 99-year agreement with 2 25-year renewals. Since Hammond is only providing access for Joliet, Joliet would be fully responsible for design, construction, owning, and operating all the facilities that we're talking about here today. Real estate for the shore facilities would need to be acquired either by Joliet or Hammond. And the options for land acquisition, there's 3 that were laid out in the preliminary access agreement. Hammond would assist Joliet in the acquisition of those shore facility properties. Provisions have also been included to allow for the transfer of the agreement to a water commission if formed. And then the last thing on the list there was added because it was important to Hammond that Joliet not supply water to their existing or anticipated customers. And since it wasn't Joliet's intent to do this because we're locating the water treatment plant near Joliet because of water quality concerns, so this provision was also added into the preliminary access agreement.
Question.
Yes.
Under the agreement, how far east could we get could Frankfurt be our customer if they wanted?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So it said on there South Cook counties. It's the southern Cook County communities are listed in there, and the specific list of communities is in the preliminary agreement. If you want to take a look at it in the prospectus documents. So the agreement also includes the basis for costs and fees. And it's really 3 types of payments. There's one-time payments that are consisting of initial payments upon execution of the preliminary agreement and final agreements, as well as enhanced right-of-way payments. There would be reimbursement payments where Joliet would pay for out-of-pocket costs for Hammond to assist Joliet with the coordination for the design and construction of the facilities in Hammond. And then there would be annual payments, and those are broken into 3 categories. First of all, property taxes or payment in lieu of taxes if Joliet's facility is determined to be tax exempt. There would be an access fee for right-of-way and easements through Hammond for the transmission main, and also there would be a volumetric charge for water pump from Lake Michigan. And similarly to previously, Joel will be getting into all those costs in a minute here. So, but at this time, I'll turn it over to Joe to talk about implementation considerations and the costs.
Thank you, Teresa. So these slides will look familiar, but again, the idea is Teresa's laid out what the alternative looks like and the agreement with Hammond. I'll walk you through what it takes to build it and what it would cost. The implementation considerations we talked about before apply here as well. And it is important to realize for the Indiana alternative, we're talking about building a new water system all the way from the source to Joliet. And so you can imagine that adds some complexity to the land acquisition, the permitting, the implementation, operations, and staffing. In this particular case, Hammond has agreed to assist us in selecting and obtaining access to a site in Hammond. And the agreement with them helps us to have access to the rights of way that we need to get the transmission main out of Indiana and into Illinois. However, there will continue to be land acquisition requirements along the transmission main. And in Joliet, we will need to acquire land for a new water treatment plant. The intent is to bring raw water to the Joliet area, have a raw water treatment plant located on the southeast side of Joliet that then would treat the water, and we would pump it from there out to the city of Joliet or the regional partners. Permitting is also an important part of this alternative. The permitting for a new intake in Lake Michigan and the permitting for a new water treatment plant are slightly more involved processes than, say, the permitting for a pumping station. And so, for example, the water treatment plant, we have to do water quality sampling to document the characteristics of the raw water quality. And then based on the advanced treatment process that's proposed as part of this alternative, we would do what we call pilot testing to basically demonstrate on a small scale how that process would work and the quality of water it would produce. Those require time, so that time for permitting has to be built into the schedule for this alternative. We'll talk about the implementation plan in a minute. The other key point here is, again, as this is a new water utility, operations and staffing will require more resources than Joliet currently uses to operate and run its existing water system. Water operators are certified based on the type of facility that they operate. To run a surface water treatment plant, Joliet would need to add some operators, perhaps train additional operators of the current. There could be transitions, but the net effect is that there would be an increase in the number of staff required to run this system. We talked about implementation before and the importance of scheduling and contracting, developing a plan that would work out. This shows a minimum of about 19 separate contracts that would be required to implement the new Indiana intake alternative. They range from a contract for the intake, a contract for the raw water pumping station, multiple contracts for transmission main work, as well as then contracts for the water treatment plant, pumping stations, and other facilities in Joliet. Again, we've reviewed this with our construction teams. The durations and the productivity required to complete these individual projects is certainly reasonable. It is doable. However, it is a lot of work that requires a lot of coordination, and we will require robust management to make sure that all the projects are done in the sequence that they need to be, and that as things change, the program is adapted to make sure that we meet our overall goal for delivering water by 2030. So costs, again, same general components, but in this case, we're going to talk about access costs for the project, and then capital costs and operation, maintenance, and replacement costs. Teresa talked about the agreement with Hammond, and again, there are costs to get access to rights of way and property in Hammond that's required to put this project into place. We talked about some one-time payments, reimbursement of out-of-pocket costs for providing assistance, and then annual payments. The one-time payments between the enhanced right-of-way payments and the initial payments and the property acquisition on the order of about $9 million over the early phase of the project, the first 10 years. And then there would be ongoing payments, basically to reflect the fact that we're going to be taking up space in right-of-way in Hammond. If we put a 60-inch diameter pipe down a public right-of-way in Hammond, there's a chunk of that right-of-way that is no longer available to the city of Hammond to use for other facilities. And they recognize that, but there has to be some compensation. So that's been the basis of this agreement, was to work with Hammond, and they've been highly cooperative to work with us to come up with an agreement that protected them, but also provided benefits to Joliet. And as Teresa said, a key focus was laying out this alternative so that all the work in Indiana could be done within the city of Hammond, so that we're not having to deal with multiple entities on the other side of the state line. Capital costs, again, these are similar charts to what we've shown before. So the top two were the 30 million gallon a day option. The bottom two are the 60 million gallon a day. We're talking about total capital cost for the 30 MGD option in 2020 dollars of just over $1 billion to build the project. And here, if you look at the color changes in that wheel, if you will, about a third of the costs are water supply production infrastructure. So that's your intake and your treatment plant. About a third are your water transmission and delivery facilities, so pumping stations and pipelines. And then a little less than a third is the Joliet distribution system improvements locally to distribute that water throughout the area. When you look down at the 60 MGD alternative, it changes just a little bit because on the Joliet end of the system, we now have a regional network that serves our regional partners as well as the work done just in Joliet. So we're able to share some of those costs across the region. Again, a key takeaway here, going from 30 MGD at $1 billion to 60 MGD at roughly $1.4 billion, we're doubling capacity, doubling the amount of water we can provide, not doubling the cost. So there is that economy of scale that we've talked about before. Operation, maintenance, and replacement is a significant element of this alternative. As we said, this is effectively a new utility from source all the way to the Joliet distribution system. So the annual cost to operate and maintain that intake, the treatment plant, and the full length of the transmission system are significant. We are still showing the credit, if you will, for the reduced cost of Joliet by moving off your existing wells and treatment plants. But under this alternative, we're looking at annual increases in operating maintenance and replacement for the water utility on the order of $10 million for the 30 MGD option or $7 million for the 60 MGD option. And again, that includes everything from labor, chemicals, energy, maintenance of the system, but it's a significant amount. Funding strategy for this option is effectively the same as before. Again, it's a combination of the WIFIA loan, the IEPA state revolving fund, and the revenue bonds. The state revolving fund capacity to support Joliet has been estimated at about $50 million a year over 5 years. So that's a constant. And so in an alternative where we have significant capital investment, there are likely to be a little bit more of the capital that would be borne by revenue bonds in this scenario. But it's still, when you look at what we call the weighted average cost of capital over the project, right now the terms that are available for these types of infrastructure projects are very attractive. So that helps us to keep the financing costs down on the overall project. The impact on rates. Again, the top chart shows annual rate increases, and a point I should make here is that these are conceptual, these are hypothetical. They are based on the numbers, on the revenue that we have to generate to fund the project. But I want to make clear that the decision on rates in Joliet rests with the city council. We've taken a consistent philosophy to provide you an indication of what this might look like. But obviously that final decision on those rate structures is your call. But it does show that we have significant rate increases in the early part of the project. And then in particular on the 60 MGD option, as the capital infrastructure is completed and we start to move into the debt service and O&M phase, and those rate increases drop off. Again, on the bottom side, we look at a typical average bill. We're increasing to 2030 for the 30 MGD scenario, we're at about $93 a month. And for 2040, up to about $149 a month. So it gives you an idea of how those rates can increase over time. And as the question was asked earlier, we'll provide some information on what the rates would be without the project and what the rates are in other communities, so you can see how those compare.
Will you be, in this presentation, setting the projected yearly increase 2020 through 2040, both Chicago and Hammond next to each other in this presentation?
I'm going to let Allison talk a little bit about
Okay.
that. But yes, the answer is yes.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I should be clear, not tonight, but that will be a follow-on from tonight. Tonight, our intent was to present the two alternatives really side by side or independently to make sure that you understood each of the alternatives. And then we'll be working to provide information to allow you to evaluate those. Again, I'll let Allison talk more about that. And then lastly, this 50-year total cost of water metric that we've talked about. And so again, a takeaway here on this option, the distribution of costs over the 50-year period for this alternative is much, it includes a significant amount of capital cost and debt service, because we are, again, building a system from scratch, from the source all the way to Joliet, and then significant operating maintenance and replacement costs. Those are the two factors that make up the majority of the cost of this alternative over that 50-year period. I went through that fairly quickly, but again, the slides are comparable, so hopefully that gives you an understanding of some of the finances attached with this alternative. With that, I'll turn it back over to Allison.
Okay, thanks, Joe. And so similar to the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative, for the new Indiana intake alternative, we also went through a similar risk analysis and SWOT analysis. So in section 7 of the prospectus for the Indiana alternative, we did go through and list all of the potential risks that have been identified and the efforts that were made to mitigate them. I'll go through and highlight then the 4 categories of risks that were developed for this alternative. So the first risk category was crossing state lines. This is something that came up a lot last year during the phase 2 study. We really wanted to reduce the uncertainty surrounding this issue. So within crossing state lines, as we were talking earlier, there's always the potential that another stakeholder or entity might dispute the ability for the city to obtain a Lake Michigan allocation via Indiana. However, as I mentioned previously, we feel that through our conversations with both Illinois DNR and Indiana DNR, and after consultation with our legal counsel on this, that there, while someone might dispute it, there is not a valid basis for that dispute. However, in the process of the dispute, it could lead to schedule delays, which, with the Indiana alternative, we don't have a lot of flexibility for that to occur. So that remains a risk. Also, a risk that was identified was related to permitting. Who is going to do the permitting, because we are crossing state lines. And through 2020, we have met with both the Illinois EPA and the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, and those are the entities that would do the permitting. And in those discussions, we understand that those two agencies are willing to work together, and if necessary, they will co-regulate on this. But in general, we understand that as long as we don't serve any customers in Indiana, that permitting will be done by the Illinois EPA. The last risk on the crossing state lines is related to any potential legislation that might be passed that would prohibit an Indiana, from water from crossing state lines. And, that is something that we, through the work of our advocacy team, have not understood that is a potential issue. And we should just point out that there are a number of Illinois communities that are already receiving water from Indiana. So this isn't a completely brand new concept. The next category is just the magnitude of the improvements. As Joe showed, this is over $1 billion in capital improvements. The construction sequencing is very complex, and there isn't a lot of flexibility if we were to get delayed for some reason. And it also results in a significant debt burden. The city will be taking on, more debt, to fund this project. However, we feel that by forming the Water Commission, we can really mitigate that risk by distributing that debt burden amongst multiple entities and not having it solely be on the city of Joliet. The next risk category is related to operations. So operating a surface water treatment plant and maintaining the intake comes with a lot of responsibility and liability. We would be required to monitor the source water and take measures. For example, if there was a spill in Lake Michigan, there's a number of industries that are on the shore in Northwest Indiana. However, we feel like we have mitigated this. We have within the agreement understanding with Hammond that we would cooperate on source water monitoring, so they can help be our eyes and ears in Indiana if there was an issue. and notify us if there was a concern. And if there was a spill, due to the length of the raw water transmission main, which is 48 miles, that takes over a day for that water to get from the lake to Joliet. So if we were notified of a spill or an issue, we'd have the ability to stop pumping the raw water into the treatment plant, use our storage or our backup before that issue was resolved. So we do feel that we have mitigated potential concerns related to monitoring of source water. And then as Joe mentioned, staffing, the Indiana option does require the addition of staff. Our current staff does not, operate a surface water treatment plant. That does require a different license. However, we feel that given the 10 years that we have, we would have the opportunity to bring on qualified staff who could then help train our existing staff so that we would be prepared for operating that facility. Also important to note that there are a number of municipalities that do have their own water treatment plants that treat Lake Michigan water. So this isn't, again, a completely foreign concept that Joliet would be able to successfully treat, Lake Michigan water. And the last category is related to land acquisition. As far as the transmission main, we feel that obtaining that right-of-way, we've mitigated that through the access agreement with Hammond. As Teresa and Joe both mentioned, we'd only be working with one partner in Indiana, and we have that access already negotiated. Once we cross state lines and get into Illinois, similar to the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative, we'll rely on and utilize the Water Commission format and the rights associated with that commission to assist with acquiring any land. For the shore facilities, we have identified 3 sites in Hammond that are technically feasible to construct and implement this project. So while we haven't actually acquired the land or identified the specific parcel, we do have flexibility and some options to do that. And Hammond is very committed to assisting us in the efforts to work with those landowners to acquire that property. For the SWOT analysis for the Indiana alternative, again, I will just highlight one key element of each category. So the strength for the Indiana alternative is that we would have complete control over the improvements, the schedule, the water treatment, the ongoing operation of the system, and the water rates. So my prior analogy that with Chicago is in that scenario, we'd be the renter. In this scenario, we're the homeowner. And by being the homeowner, you have that control, but then you also have all of the risks associated with, being that owner and having to maintain the system and deal with any issues that may arise. A key weakness that we identified is just simply the magnitude of the program. And there is definitely but in undertaking this big of a program, it is more sensitive to potential schedule delays, even though we do feel that with the contracting plan that Joe presented, that it is feasible that this will be done by 2030. We have a really good opportunity to work with Hammond, Indiana. They've been an excellent partner over the past 6 months in working on the preliminary agreement. They're very committed to working with us on the source water monitoring to make sure that we're all committed to preserving Lake Michigan as a high quality water source. And then the one threat or key threat is related just to potential challenges to the interstate use of water. At this time, the work that our advocacy team has done has not identified any issue with that. However, as this project becomes more available out in the public, there is the concern that there could be some challenges to crossing state lines. But again, Hammond has agreed and understands that they would work with us to help mitigate any of those risks that might come up in Indiana. So to conclude, the business case, this is a very bold plan. A bold plan, it's very exciting, but it has the associated risks that go along with that. We would have the responsibility and liability for all of the infrastructure that would be designed, built, and financed, and then owned by the city of Joliet. To assist with this, we have this long-term relationship with the city of Hammond for access, which is, 99 years. We'd have the ability to design the water treatment plant to do what we want, how we want to have the water treated. We'd be able to implement the advanced water treatment process, which will offer the ability to treat for those known emerging contaminants. This infrastructure is all going to be brand new. And so we don't anticipate that there would be any issues or major expenditures required for 50+ years. However, again, it's a very complex project, and it'd be important that we understand all that construction sequencing and have an excellent program to manage the implementation of it. But to conclude, we would have total control over the full program implementation, operations, and future rate setting.
Yes.
Yep.
First, I'll comment. I have a couple of questions, but you took the words out of my mouth. We're comparing a brand spanking new system to a 70-year-old system. No matter how well kept it's been, over the next 50 years, that could turn into hundreds of millions of dollars of improvements on the 70-year-old system. And the new system won't even be 70 by then. So I think that's huge to point out. And this Chicago option, I should have asked it back then, but did we address any need for mitigating water age problems?
And yes, I'll have Teresa respond to that.
Was that in the proposal, Teresa? Included?
We did some, so no, I don't think it's addressed specifically in the prospectus, but we did look at the pipe diameter, the minimum velocities, and we looked at the time it would take to travel from Chicago to Joliet, and it's a little less than a day. And so we feel based on the chlorine levels that it wouldn't degrade in that time, but it does, and that's in the minimum day scenario where it's about 22 hours in the pipeline. So it is, it does travel a distance, and it would potentially degrade water quality, specifically chlorine residual. But we have assumed that there would be chlorine addition that would happen at Joliet prior to going into the Joliet distribution system.
So pretty much we're confident, but we could call it as a very tiny, unpredictable thing.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. You answered my question beautifully. Why are we bringing up property taxes? Isn't the city of Joliet tax exempt as a
So
city?
that was something during the negotiation with Hammond, that owning property in another state, they wanted to make sure that, their property that they have wouldn't be tax exempt, and they would be able to collect the taxes. So that's why there's the pilot.
I have the same concern we have in economic development.
Right.
That we don't want to see nonprofits taking over prime spots that would go to, okay, fair enough. And the other advantage I see here that interests me is there's no possibility on the brand new system of any, you talked about lead replacement, surface replacement in Chicago, or remediations. Joliet, of course, has got a very minimal amount of lead, and only in the private services. This system would be isolated, brand new, and there would be no possibility of any leaching of anything of that nature or anything else from an older system.
Yeah, so with everything going on, the water source transfer plan is a critical component of both alternatives. And there is a difference between the two alternatives and how, that water source transfer plan would be implemented. And again, I'll have Teresa answer this in more detail, because that is one benefit of the Indiana alternative, is that we would be able to determine and change treatment as necessary during the water source transfer.
Yeah, so part of the 2020 evaluation, one of our team members was the Cornwell Engineering Group. They're a nationally known corrosion control expert, and they started putting together an evaluation of the existing wells and the water quality associated with them, plus the two alternative sources, to determine whether there would be the potential for issues with the transfer between sources. And so they determined that, at the surface, it didn't seem like there would be a problem with transferring to either source. However, it was noted that Chicago is looking at installing corrosion control for orthophosphate, and there was a concern that there pH adjustment associated with that could cause concerns. And so one of the things that would happen as part of the 2021 would be a water source transfer testing plan that would look at any kind of treatment or conditioning that might be required so that there wouldn't be an impact to Joliet. And so that was one of the things that was identified as a potential risk to Chicago if it wasn't compatible, but as a positive to the Indiana option, that if there was an issue with the proposed treatment, that Joliet would be able to adjust treatment in order to mitigate that impact.
And this, like you say, has been addressed in the preliminary stages, but this would probably be a good example of what we talk about, of having more obstacles to go through on the Chicago side because we don't have total control from extraction to consumer use, whereas the Hammond one, we would have that total control.
Yeah, so there is potential, and we won't know the true potential of that, but yes, there's ways to mitigate for Indiana that there would be more difficult with Chicago.
Thank you. That's all I have, Mayor.
I have a couple questions. As has been pointed out, myself and Allison have had several meetings with both representatives from Chicago and Hammond. Chicago has been pumping, cleaning water from the lake and selling it for over 100 years now. Obviously, we've been doing it from an aquifer. Does their experience, is that something that we should be taking into account versus us owning and doing this on our own? Is there a learning curve or unknown expenses that we may run into because we haven't done this before?
No, I'm completely confident that, over the next 10 years, we would bring on the staff with the experience to operate a, Lake Michigan treatment plant. There's a number of facilities, along the lake. Evanston has a treatment plant. I believe Highland Park has a treatment plant. Gary has a treatment plant. Hammond has a treatment plant. So, it's not unique to Chicago how to treat Lake Michigan water. The difference is Chicago has, the regionalization and the backing of millions of customers. So they can offer that to us when, issues arise. They definitely have the ability to, have that very strong voice that comes with being a very large utility.
Thank you. The second question has to do, and this was raised in a meeting this last week. I guess just by common sense, the water quality in Northwest Indiana may not be as good as the water quality up a little bit further north because of the amount of industry and the steel mills that are in the area. Number one, is that true? And number two, is that cost being taken into effect that cleaning the water from southern Lake Michigan is going to be more expensive than it would be a little bit further north?
Yeah, I'll have Joe answer this because we did do a lot of raw water quality evaluation and then incorporated that into the treatment plan evaluation.
Yes, thanks, Allison. Good question, Mayor. And I think what's important, when we went back and looked at the historic water quality data for the southwestern part of Lake Michigan all the way up into Chicago, what we found is in typical kind of baseline water quality, there's really no difference between northwestern Indiana and Chicago area. They're not that far apart when you consider the whole scale of the lake. So the baseline water quality is very similar. There is a little bit more variability in northwest Indiana because of the way the lake is structured and the way that waves come in. It's shallower, so there is potential for variations in what we call turbidity, or kind of the cloudiness of the water. And so a facility in northwest Indiana would need to have the ability to manage that. And then as far as the concern about industry, while there certainly is a lot of industry in northwest Indiana, those industries do not discharge their wastewater to Lake Michigan. They have permitted discharges to waterways in northwest Indiana. Now, there is the potential for a spill that has happened in past history. There is potential for combined sewer overflows. Quite honestly, that can happen both in Chicago and northwest Indiana. So I think the answer to your question is there does require a little bit more attention to making sure we have a water treatment process for northwest Indiana that is able to handle variability. And that's part of the reason when we went through the process evaluation for the Indiana option, we recommended and the council concurred with the concept of using an advanced treatment process that includes the typical processes used by surface water plants in the area, plus the addition of ozone and other specialized filtration methods to make sure we can accommodate that variation.
Thank you.
One
Yes.
more. What is, what's the depth? I don't need a number. Is the depth that we're projecting our intake at? Is it deep enough? Is it similar to Hammond's current depth? And has Hammond ever had any problems with that depth on the shallow side, so to speak, of Lake Michigan?
Yeah, and again, I'll turn this to Joe, but, we have done that evaluation, and the issues that Hammond has experienced, we have addressed in the design for the new intake.
So we learn from their problems. Okay.
And yes, sir. And the main issue with, the two main issues with depth of an intake have to do with, obviously, number one, protection against navigation. You don't want a boat hitting it or dragging an anchor across it or something like that. And number two, the more common issue that comes up is what's called icing or frazzle ice. And during very cold periods in the winter, you get a cold, moonless, still night. The water actually down at the bottom of the lake can get very cold, and in certain conditions forms ice that can accumulate on structures and in some cases can clog an intake. In general, there's a depth range that we would like to have that intake out into to minimize that risk of frazzle ice formation. But you have to balance that depth with the cost of going far enough out to get there. So the short answer to your question is our 7,000 foot proposed intake is significantly longer than Hammond's current intakes. I think Hammond has had icing problems in the past. In addition, we've built into our design a provision for the installation of basically heaters at the inlet structure. This is an approach that's been used by the city of Evanston for some years. We're not trying to heat the lake, but we're providing just enough heat during cold periods to prevent the formation of that ice. So we feel like we've struck a good balance between cost and depth in terms of the intake. Plus we provide this extra mitigation for managing the risk of ice formation.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I just have, overall, Allison, I remember when we started this over a year ago, the general consensus then, before we learned anything about all these other entities, was to go with Chicago. And does that still hold true with the majority? Because actually, I would like to hear from residents what they think about all this that they were watching tonight, whether they think we should go with the brand new system and overall, the 99-year contract rather than with the Chicago older infrastructure, and if there's contaminants in it, they won't do it, they won't clean it up for us, and a 50-year contract. So,
Yeah, it's a
does
perfect
that still hold
segue.
true with the committees?
At the end of last year, the Environmental Commission's recommendation was to proceed with the Indiana alternative, and then in January, the City Council then selected to continue to evaluate two alternatives. But I do want to finish up a few more slides that kind of talk about the roadmap and how the public can get engaged. So
Okay,
thank
all
you
right.
for that.
Thank
May
you.
I ask you one more question before you go?
Oh,
on?
sure.
Okay. You do mention with the Indiana intake that we would be hiring quite a few skilled employees.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw in here it was 8, is that what you anticipate?
Yes, and actually that was a typo. I apologize. It's 14 is the
Okay.
accurate number.
So, obviously with salary and benefits, has that been put into these calculations?
Yes, it has.
Okay.
Okay, so just quickly to conclude, a lot of information was discussed tonight. We know this is the first time that you and the public are hearing it. So we wanted to get the information out there, as Joe said earlier, just to, have the information on the two alternatives. You can, go back, digest it, come up with questions. Please, send those to me. We are going to, do a lot of outreach in the upcoming month to obtain those public comments. Starting tomorrow, the documents that are the prospectus, as well as all of the other engineering documents, will be posted on the project website at rethinkwaterjoliet.org. So again, we're completely committed to an open and transparent process. The preliminary agreements with Chicago and Hammond are part of that prospectus that will be made available online. So the public will have the opportunity to read that information. We're also going to be having a public forum, and of course, then due to COVID restrictions, this will be a online and virtual event. So we're going to be having an online event where residents can go to the website, they can view a brief presentation, look at some key slides that kind of show what we talked about tonight, and then after they review that information, they can provide a comment directly on the website. We're also going to have 2 live virtual events. Those will be meetings with stakeholders. Those will be December 2nd and December 3rd. And anyone who's interested in participating in those, they can go on the website and register. And those 2 events will present the same information, but just at different times to allow the greatest participation. For any residents who don't have the ability to go online, we're developing a newsletter, 4-page newsletter summarizing the information available, and they can call and we will mail that to them. That'll also be available online. And then comments are also going to be received via phone. So residents can call our public utilities number at 815-724-4220 and make a comment. When we collect all those comments, we'll be sending them to the council. Again, then after that, we are going to be working on providing you with supplemental information, really doing that alternative comparison. I know that is really kind of the next step that we need to provide to the council, is how do these 2 alternatives compare, providing that side-by-side evaluation of the costs and impacts to rates. So we will be getting that information out to you in December. We have another city council workshop scheduled for December 17th. From 5:30 to 7:30. We'll be presenting and discussing that alternative comparison. And we're also going to be having representatives from Chicago and Hammond at that meeting, and they can directly answer any questions that you might have related to those alternatives. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we anticipate that the water source would be selected in January. So again, our program schedule, just to show this up, puts on the screen again, we have a lot to do. In 2021, as Joe mentioned, we have a deadline with our WIFIA funding to be able to submit that 30% design by the end of next year in December. So it's very crucial that we move forward with making this decision in January, so that all of that preliminary engineering work can be started next year, so that we can make sure that by 2030 we have the new water source online. And then just to conclude, one more plug for the virtual events that we have going on in December. Please encourage anyone you know to participate. Lots of ways to provide comment, and we will be providing that information to the council. So with that, I will conclude.
A couple of things, Allison. Number one, thank you for all the work, and we say this every time, but Allison Swisher's done a tremendous amount of work, as you can see by the work product. Also, thank you to our consultants. You guys are doing a great job in answering every question, so we appreciate it. Mayor Lightfoot and the city of Chicago has extended the offer. If any of us wish to go up and look at their actual water system, they actually encourage that we do that. And I told her I do believe people from the city council will be willing to do that. So if you're interested, if you can contact my office or Allison, and we will be in touch with them to try to do that. And facilitate that in the between now and I think December. Mm-hmm. And then both Mayor McDermott from Hammond and Mayor Lightfoot indicated they are going to be present at our city council meeting on December 17th. So to give you an idea of how serious those 2 communities are taking what we're trying to do. It isn't just, it's obviously a big issue for us here in Joliet, but it's also a big issue for both of them. And both of those mayors are willing to come to Joliet to speak with us directly. And then finally, I do want to give credit to Councilwoman Sherry Reardon. Allison, as you pointed out, that the Water Commission recommended Indiana. And if my memory serves me right, when we went to vote on that last year, Councilwoman, you insisted or made the motion to keep 2 sources open. And I think that clearly has helped in our negotiations. As you guys pointed out, how far Chicago has moved from their original offer and the deal that we've struck with Hammond. So compliments to you and the council for following. That was the right way to approach this. I just want to put that on the record.
Agreed.
I don't believe there's anyone here for public comment, so you just need a motion to adjourn.
Well, actually, one more comment.
Okay.
It's 7:35.
Did you sign up there?
Oh, good job, thank you.
Oh, okay, all right, I thought you were serious. Okay. Just need a motion to adjourn.
I'm gonna make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
Okay, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Motion passed, adjourned.
That's some good stuff.
Thanksgiving.